Hi, this is Jacob again. For those of you new to, I guess, my channel, I really try and make Samoan grammar lessons, particularly for those that are coming from an English-speaking background that are interested in learning Samoan. So whether that be, you're of Samoan heritage, or maybe you have friends and family that are of Samoan heritage, and you just want to learn how to communicate better with them. This video is really going to be more about government and culture than it is about language, but I've got some vocab at the end. The reason I'm making this video is because there is at least at the time I'm recording this, there was recently an election where a new prime minister was elected. It's Samoa's first female prime minister, and I thought there might be a lot of conversation going on that has to do with government, and I thought maybe this video would be helpful in terms of just kind of understanding or helping to follow along in some of the conversation. So what I plan to address today is village government and the Matai or Matai system, the federal government, and again, I'll give some vocab just to kind of help things along. Again, if you're new to this channel, I learned Samoan as a 19-year-old. I served as a missionary in Samoa, and then I taught Samoan for about maybe 3 or 4 years after that to new missionaries going out. So again, I hope this is helpful. As always, I'll ask you again, if this is something helpful to you, please leave a comment, hit like or subscribe. Let me know if I got something wrong, which I probably did. In my mind, talking about government in a foreign language and in a foreign country is probably the hardest thing to do. I definitely don't think that I'm an expert here, but what I've tried to lay out is a high-level overview to kind of help someone kind of get their bearings. And I'm sure that I probably got a few things wrong. So I really welcome people making comments and let me know where I did get those things wrong, because I would assume that anyone who actually was, grew up in Samoa would potentially know this a whole lot better than I did. So that being said, what I wanted to start with was kind of the village government overview, and the reason why that is because there's a big connection between the village government and the federal government, and a lot of and a lot of that even actually starts at the family. So I thought we'd try and talk about the foundation instead of some of the vocab, and then talk about how that relates to the federal government. So first, on the left-hand side here, kind of got a little diagram and sort of meant to be a spectrum. We've got the ainga, and as you might know from previous videos, ainga is the Samoan word for family, but it doesn't mean mom, dad, brother, sister. It's the broad, more extended family. That's ainga. And then there's the nu. The nu is the village. And then there's the itumalo, which is the district. And so really starting at the family, within every Samoan family, there are certain chief titles. And what a chief title really is I guess the way that I would describe it is it's a name that gets passed down from generation to generation. And it usually has its own sort of story for how it came into being. For example, one of Samoa's paramount chief titles is Malietoa. And the way that, at least my understanding of the way that title came to be was when the Tongans ruled Samoa, they were eventually kicked out. And as the Tongan king was leaving, he said, Malietoa, Malietau, Oleao Foi, Eletoisau. I think that's what it said. But basically what it means is, Malietoa means, good job being brave, or good job warriors. Mariatao, good job warring. Oleao foi, I will return. Eletoisau, and never come back again. And so that sort of phrase from the Tongan king then became the beginnings of the Marietoa chief title, which I assume kind of came to one of the key people leading sort of that effort, and then has since been passed down from generation to generation. So a lot of these chief titles, if you break them down, they actually kind of mean something, or they kind of convey a little bit of the story. And so they don't sound like John or, some regular old name. It's a chief title. Anyway, those chief titles, first and foremost, are really bound to a single ainga. And it's up to that family to appoint who is going to inherit this title. Sometimes they may split the title. And there's different decisions there's different sort of factors that go into people's decisions for who's going to assume this title. Is it because, hey, this person has wealth or this person has influence and they would be the best holder of this title? So more or less, that's a family decision as to how that's going to take place. And then once you're a title holder, you obviously have certain rights and obligations when it comes to ruling in the family, but then also multiple ainga compose a single village. So it's not like in the U.S. where you kind of just move to wherever you want to go because it's close to your job or whatever. Not to say that nobody does that, but typically because of the way land ownership works, you are in a village because that's where your family is from, or you've married into that family. So they call that sometimes fayava or nofutane. So if you are living in your wife's, if you're a husband and you were living in your wife's village, that's called fayava. And if you are living in your husband's village, that's called nofutane. And so, anyway, the point being is that aingas belong to nu'us, and aingas have titles, and nu'us have titles that kind of roll up into them. And then furthermore, obviously different villages belong within certain districts, and these districts really predate the federal government as we know it today. It predates European contact. So these were almost kind of like little, kind of governmental bodies to begin with. So think of them like states. Anyway, so those all roll up to Itu Malo, and Itu Malo have their own sort of capitals. So just to kind of give you sort of that brief view of how things roll up, and obviously Itu Malo, the next step above that would be the federal government in Samoa. So going on, I thought I'd just give a quick picture. I stole this from Wikipedia, but in here I'm really just talking about Western Samoa, since we're going to be talking about Western Samoa's government. But the same structure that I talked about before in terms of ainga and nu'u, ainga and family government, village government, and even loosely district, that applies in American Samoa as well. But I'm strictly talking about Western Samoa now because that's where the federal government is. It's an independent nation, whereas American Samoa is a territory of the U.S. So as you can see, there's 11 districts in Samoa. On the left-hand side of the table here, you'll see the district name, and then they all have different capitals. So again, kind of like states and state capitals. So there's Tuamasanga, the capital there is Afenga. A'ana is a district, and the capital village there is Liulumuenga. There's Aingai-Letai, and then Murifunua would be the capital of that district. Atua is a district, and Lufi-Lufi is its capital. Va'aufonoti is a district, and Samamea would be its capital. And then going into the islands of Savai'i, Savai'i has Fa'asalelelanga, which is a district, and then Safotulafai being the village capital, Nganga'i Maunga and Saleaula being the capital there, Nganga'i Maunga, and then Aupo being the capital there. Vaisingano is a district, Asao is its capital, Satupaitea, and then Satupaitea is also the capital, and then Palauli is a district, and then Vailoa would be its capital. So just kind of give you an idea. I thought I'd try and pronounce them. Hopefully I got all those right, because some of these I don't hear in everyday language, so I may have mispronounced that. Like I think Aupo it might have a glottal stop in there. Anyway, going on to what is this system, this Fa'amatai system. I don't know if you noticed, but in 2 slides back, underneath those 3 circles of Ainga, Nu'u, and Itu Malo, underneath it was sort of a bracket that said Fa'amatai, meaning that Fa'amatai is sort of the chieftain type of system that exists in Samoa, beginning at the family level. And so really when you break that down, those chief titles I mentioned, they fall into 1 of 2 categories. They are either an ali'i title or they are a tulafale title. So ali'i in Samoan is a chief, which is sometimes known as the sitting chief, and they're technically the true decision makers, but they are not the ones who are usually saying much of anything in the actual village meetings. So each ali'i is actually paired with a tulafale. A tulafale is known as an orator or a failaunga, or sometimes they're called high-talking chiefs or talking chiefs. And the reason they get this name is because they're the ones who are actually representing the ali'i, and they're the ones who are actually the ones tasked with having the words in the meeting. And that might sound really simple. You might think like, well, why wouldn't the chief just speak for himself? Wouldn't that be more straightforward? But Samoan sort of decorum in these village sort of meetings, anything that's said is actually very speech-like. It's very sort of saturated in Samoan culture, meaning it's not just saying, hey, I want to upgrade the town hall. That's not what you would say. There's a whole protocol for respecting everyone who's in the room, for illustrating your point by using proverbs and echoing back to Samoan legend or, certain proverbs that you might have, noticed in nature. And it's very flowery and very poetic type nature. And you are more influential. You're an ali'i who can bear more power by having a better tula'afale, who's able to be persuasive and kind of in some ways be impressive to other groups and potentially other village delegations. So it's kind of complicated, but that's kind of the dynamic. You got the sitting chief who actually technically makes the decisions. You've got the high talking chief who's really representing you throughout all of these meetings and has to be very, very well educated in Samoan culture and Samoan legend and history and all that stuff. And so what I thought I'd throw up here on the left-hand side is some of the words that you would associate with some of these chiefs. So an ali'i, when you would address them, you would call them lau susunga. And this is kind of equivalent to saying like your highness to a king, or it might be saying like your honor to a judge. It's a respectful address to them. And so instead of saying you would never say you would say lau susunga. And their wife is not just a to'alua or a wife. Their wife will be a faletua. Faletua is the respectful term for their wife. And their house is not just a fale or house, it is a mauta. It's almost like, it's not really like mansion, but you know what I'm saying? It's a respectful way of referring to their abode, if you will. On a tula'afale, it's kind of the same thing. There are respectful terms for them as well, but they're distinct. And so when you're addressing a tula'afale, assuming that you know that they're a tula'afale or they hold a tula'afale chieftain title, you would address them as lautofa. And again, it's kind of like your highness or your honor. It's a respectful way of addressing them. Their wife is a tausi, and their house is a lawa. So a kind of a little fact for you guys. Generally, if you don't know someone's titleship or if they have any at all, it's okay to use the ali'i terms to address them. Like if you don't know someone, it would be okay for you to call them lau susunga. It's very respectful. So sometimes it might be overkill. Like you wouldn't say this to your grandma, lau susunga. It sounds really formal. But technically you can apply this to strangers that you don't know yet. It's very respectful. And again, they might not technically have an ali'i title, but again, it's respectful. And really what those chiefs are responsible for doing is the village business. So they might be creating rules or tula'afono for the nu'u. For the village, or poloa'inga, we'll talk about that word later. And maybe one of those tula'afono is like a sa. A sa is kind of like a village curfew or like a prayer hour. And so if you're in Samoa visiting and you're walking along the road and you hear, at night, you hear the gong sort of go off, or you hear the conch shell being blown, that might actually be the indicator that the sa is about to begin. And it would be a clue to any visitors that they should at least temporarily, potentially, maybe sit on the side of the road, or if you have family or friends there, that it would probably be time to go back up to the house, and really you would be gathering for the nightly lotu, the nightly prayer that you would have with your family. Some villages take it a little further, and they actually have a curfew for we just don't want people wandering around past a certain time. So that's kind of some of the business that these chiefs can be enforcing. And in Samoa, that's all very legal. Different villages are allowed to govern themselves in that way. And there's obviously the regular stuff that would be decided in those meetings, like upkeep of the village and different things like that happen. So when it comes to the federal government, the way that this connects back to the village government is that, well, number one, Samoa at the federal level is a parliamentary system. And so they have a prime minister at the very top, and they also have a head of state. And I'll kind of talk about the difference there. And then so they have a prime minister, and really they come from parliament. They're elected by parliament to take on that role. And parliament is composed almost entirely of those who have chief titles. There's an exception. There are two spots within Samoan parliament that are reserved to represent non-Samoans, and they do not have to have titles, but all other 48 or so, I believe, have chieftain titles. And they obviously are representing the different districts within Samoa. So the parliament meets and they actually elect a new prime minister, which recently happened. So they elected for the first time a female prime minister, and that was, let's see, Fiame Naomi Mataafa. We'll talk about Mataafa in a minute. She actually came from a new government party called FAST, so you may have heard that. And that stands for Fa'atuatua, Iliatua, Samoa, Watasi, which translates to basically faith in God, Samoa is one. And she basically defeated the incumbent, who was Tuilaepa Aiono Sailele Maliele Ngaoi. And he was representing the HRPP party, the Human Rights Protection Party, which was kind of the only party that was sort of in Samoa up until relatively recently. So anyway, kind of interesting. Anyway, so when a new prime minister is elected, they're responsible for choosing their cabinet. So in this case, that's Kabineta. And then both the prime minister and Kabineta are then sort of blessed or kind of technically appointed by the head of state, which is the Au Mamalu. Au Mamalu means glorified head, which is the head of state. And the head of state himself is actually elected by parliament as well. So the tricky things maybe to point out are, even though the head of state is elected by parliament, they haven't had that many different heads of state in place, because the very first heads of state, there was actually two people appointed to be joint heads of state, and those were lifetime appointments when Samoa first gained its independence. And so they haven't had that many people that have been elected to the position. So historically, the heads of state have actually been holders of at least one of the four paramount chief titles in Samoa. I mentioned one before of Mariatua. There are three others. There's Tamasese, Mataafa, which is one of the titles that the new prime minister holds, and then Tui Maleali Ifano, which is the fourth paramount title. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know all the background of all these titles, but suffice it to say, it is regarded, at least in Western Samoa, that these are four of the highest titles in all of Samoa, and historically, the head of state has had one of these. It doesn't technically have to be that way. It's not written in the Constitution, but the current head of state certainly has one of these titles. In addition, the heads of state may also have papa titles. And so, unfortunately, I'm covering one of them here, but that's Tuia Tua, Tuia Ana, Ngatoa Itele, and then Vai. To be honest, I don't remember what the other one is. These are a little bit different, and I struggle to understand exactly how these are different. But Tui is an old Samoan word that kind of means king, and so it was a very royal title to have this. And so Tuia Tua would be like the king of the Atua district. Tuia Ana is like the king of the Ana district. There's also, over in American Samoa, Tui Manua. That was a very important title that used to have influence over the entire archipelago. Obviously not so much anymore because of just the separation of American and Western Samoa. That probably being the primary one. But also after the chasing the Tongans out, that was, Tui Manua was apparently a little bit closer to the Tongan parties, I guess, at that time. And so when they were kicked out, Tui Manua kind of decreased in prominence. Anyway, long story short, everyone in parliament has to have a chief title, with those two exceptions. The prime minister is chosen by parliament from parliament. They choose a cabinet. The head of state is also elected by parliament every 5 years, typically has a paramount chief title. And they do some things with the judiciary, but they also they're largely a figurehead from my understanding, but they kind of appoint those that have already been elected. So when we talk about Fiame Naomi Mataafa, she is the new Palemia, she's the new prime minister, and she is tasked with choosing a new cabinet, which would then be sort of blessed or sanctioned by the Au Mamalu, the head of state, which again is one of the holders of the four paramount chief titles, even though obviously, Fiame Naomi Mataafa, she has the Mataafa title. So she also has a paramount chief title. That's not a requirement for being prime minister. She just happens to be that, as she's inherited that title from her family. I believe her grandfather, her father, was a former head of state, if I'm not mistaken, which it could be. Or maybe the first prime minister. Anyway. So hopefully that was helpful just in terms of having a broad overview of how Samoan government works, how it's related to the village government and what you'll actually notice on the day-to-day if you're traveling throughout the country. And then I've also got some vocab here that might come up and be helpful as you try and talk about it more, or as you listen to other people talk about it. So again, kind of in similar videos, I'll go through and I'll try and pronounce slowly the Samoan word, and then obviously introduce what the English translation is, and I'll work from left to right. So kapineta, kapineta is cabinet. Poroainga, poroainga, poroainga is a law. Or if you read, sort of Samoan Bible or scriptures, that would be the same as commandment in biblical passages. Ao mamalu, ao mamalu is head of state. Ao is the honorific word for head instead of ulu, and mamalu is like glorified. So it kind of means glorified head. Fa'a la potopotonga, fa'a la potopotonga is assembly. So you can think of like the legislative body getting together as the fa'a la potopotonga. Malo, malo means a lot of different things. In this case, it means government. In other videos, I've introduced it as being a word for hi or as congratulations. In this case, we're talking about a government. Palota, palota, palota means to vote. Palemene, palemene, palemene is parliament. Govana, govana, that's not a tough one. This is governor. In Western Samoa, you'll have governors of like the Whare Tupu o Samoa, the Central Bank of Samoa. But in American Samoa, there is a governor of the territory and they're elected. And so that would also be a govana. Sui, sui is a representative. Sui. Fono, fono or fonotanga is a meeting. La fonga tupe, la fonga tupe. Those are taxes. Lafo means to throw. La fonga is the noun form of that verb. And then tupe is money. So it's kind of like throwing your money. It's a good description of taxes. Palemia, palemia. Palemia is a prime minister. Minisita, minisita is minister. Pule, pule is power or authority. Tofia or tofinga. Tofia is the verb appointed. Tofinga is the noun form, appointment. Itu malo, it means district, and literally it translates to portion of the government. Itu malo, or portion of the kingdom in some ways. Matai, matai is a general term for chief. Ali'i, ali'i is the high chief, or sometimes called sitting chief. Tula fale is a high talking chief. Faletua is an ali'i's wife. Faletua. And Tausi is a Tula Fale's wife. So again, I hope this is helpful. If it is, please subscribe or like it or leave a comment. Let me know if these things are helpful to you, and I'll do my best to try and make more. Thanks, everyone. Bye.